I don't know exactly how it came about, but we had a huge influx of heroin in Norway as a result of the war in the Balkans. Serbs and Bosnians and Albanians were selling heroin throughout Europe to finance the war and buy weapons. And we didn't have a drug or a heroin problem before. All of a sudden, Oslo was full of kids taking heroin and who had never been exposed to it before. And it was so bad that, you know, it wasn't just about social outcasts or people who were in a vulnerable situation. And I think at some point I just reflected on what would happen if, you know, the people ODing, it was huge, you know, Oslo was the overdose capital of Europe at some point. And I started reflecting on what would I do if something like that would happen to one of my kids. And like most people, I consider myself rather civilized, and I was just reflecting on how civilized would I be in approaching that, and how would I go about if it was just, you know, shut down as a, you know, an accidental overdose and never investigated by the police. Yeah. So I kind of followed that thought, and at some point I realized that you know, you could get into a lot of messy stuff, and depending on how motivated you are, you could probably by, you know, beginner's luck and dedication inflict a lot of damage on rather skilled professionals. But at some point you run into a huge problem. And I discussed it with the screenwriter and a producer at that time, and it seemed, although with a tragic departure point, it was quite obvious that it would be quite a potential for a dark comedy. I hadn't expected to do it myself. It's flattering when Michael Schamberg asks you to do it, and for the reasons that he said so. But it's also well-founded, because I think tone is something very underrated or very often underrated in filmmaking. And he very correctly pointed out that it is hard to strike a tone that, especially a tone that is somebody else's tone. And I think he felt it was essential to the project to have that, and it was not just a sort of cookie-cutter template for another film. So it forced me to give it a good think. Like most moviegoers in the world, I was a huge fan of Liam. I think he's a magnificent actor. I've been a huge fan since I saw him, I think, the first time. He's very versatile, and he's not afraid to take on new challenges. And the fact that he's had this, 8-10 years or whatever as a, very successful action actor, and then being or wanting to do something different with it, not being complacent, just allowing himself to be challenged in new ways, I thought was very attractive. I think it speaks volumes about how curious he is as a human being. I think overall I felt very well. Liam was like almost a guide. He was very generous to me. He was curious about my thought about how to do things. But at the same time, he's a very experienced actor. So, and he was also challenging me if I was doing something that he felt was unoriginal, for instance. So he wouldn't let me get away with just doing something that either he'd done before or he felt that he'd seen before, in a kind way. But it felt like he was a very generous contributor. I think the most memorable moment for me was I had dragged him and Tom Jackson and a skeleton crew up on the mountain where at the end of the movie there's a gate that they have to pass before the finale. And it was at nighttime, and it was howling winds outside, and although we had wind machines, etc., there to create a snowstorm, Liam gets out of the truck and goes to open the gate, and he vanishes in the whiteout in the snow. And after only about 50, 60 feet or something. And it was just magnificent to just see him disappear. And instead of, going for shelter or something, he just did his action and opened the gate and was disappearing. And then he reappeared, and it became almost like this magical moment. And he stayed in character and just did his thing instead of being, frightened or put off by the sudden burst of whiteout. I agree. I think they're all terrific. I've been a huge fan of Laura since the first time I saw her. I think was in Wild at Heart. I think for me, even the smallest role is important because the whole, illusion can fall apart, and it's a misconception to think, well, it's just a small part. You can get away with a lesser actor, I think, and it's the opposite. That's an actor who only has one chance to get it right, so you better get somebody who can handle it, And many of the guys who come into this, Arnold, Dominic, they are all people that, in one way or another, contribute to keeping an illusion and keeping a very sort of multifaceted environment and a universe alive. So you couldn't be without them. I think Aya, Julia Jones, who plays Viking's, Tom Bateman's wife. She's the most courageous person in the film. She's the only one who has the courage to stand up to this tyrant, And Tom is a big man, and she's learned to actually be believable as somebody who doesn't just run away because of his being physically very imposing. It speaks to how she's able to be a very cool and very resolved human being.